Hello, friends, and welcome back to Multi-Modern Talkin. This is the third episode in this occasional series that I'm doing here, covering these staple decks in the multi-modern format. And today we're going to be running through the first non-combo deck of this entire discussion, which is multi-modern Moonless Blue Moon, which is quite the name. It is essentially a blue-red control, and the reason that I wanted to cover this, besides there being popular demand from the Discord, was that it I think is a good representative of what mid-range and control archetypes look like in the format. And furthermore, this is a deck with a lot of possibilities in regards to continual brewing and refinement. So with that in mind, I wanted to cover what the current list looks like, talk about its future, and go through this pretty extensive maybe board that I've constructed for ourselves over here. As per usual, we're going to start at the very top, run through all of the cards in the deck, and then we'll talk about the meta performance as well as the possible changes that could come from bans and unbans near the end of our discussion. So let's start here with the 12 creatures in the deck. This is a pretty interesting slot or set of slots for the deck because it is the point at which you determine whether or not you are broadly this blue moon control style archetype or you want to go a bit more towards the mid-range blue-red decks that also exist in the format. What I think defines Moonless Blue Moon versus, say, is it tempo or is it mid-range is that you are excising things like Ragavan Pilferer, Dragon's Rage Channelers, and other small creatures that typically gain incremental value, but don't necessarily contribute to your overarching game plan. That being said, Ledger Shredder is very, very good in this deck and is one of these tempo-y cards that we still have elected to play, just because A, it's a flying threat, which is very, very good in this format, especially due to the fact that a lot of the go wide creature strategies don't really have the ability to interact with flyers. And second, it also provides a lot of really solid card selection. It puts things into the graveyard that we have some ability to access and use in the future, but most importantly, it's just a card that is able to get big and it gives you at least something to do on turn 1 to turn 2. Snapcaster Mage, although it's also 2 mana, much less often are you playing this super early for value. This is a card that you are typically using to just flashback one of your spells. This is just one of the most classic cards that you see in any control archetype running blue, and I think that running the full playset is just absolutely fantastic. I understand that, this card goes in and out of favor within the realm of regular modern, but here you get so much value out of being able to access your library with it. We're running 2 Subtlety. Subtlety is a card that is oftentimes good, but sometimes just does absolutely nothing. And because of that, I find myself not really willing to run the full 4 playset, especially when there's so many other cards to run. And I think that a huge density of spells, we're running 42, is absolutely necessary. So because of that, I really think that I'd rather just go towards, say, 2 more Archmage's Charm, for instance, rather than playing something that most oftentimes is just acting as a relatively narrow instant counterspell. We're also running 2 Platinum Empyrean, which is kind of one of the core win conditions of our deck, if not the main core win condition. It's basically partnered here with the 4 Madcap Experiment. We'll talk about that interaction once we get to the sorcery half of this combo, but the basic idea is that you are able to fish through your deck, get this, not take any damage from the Madcap Experiment, and just stabilize on board. This is one of your main ways of just shutting down aggro decks, and oftentimes people just have absolutely no way to deal with this. Moving on from our creatures, let's get into our planeswalkers. We're running 6 total, 4 Teferi Master of Time and 2 Ral Izzet Viceroys, and these are the secondary and tertiary win conditions of the deck beyond just sticking a Platinum Empyrean. Teferi MOT is probably the premier planeswalker in this format by virtue of it being able to activate not only on your own turn, but on each of your opponent's turns. And the card filtering that it is able to produce because of this is just absolutely unmatched. You are sculpting your deck so heavily with a combination of him, Ral, Ledger Shredder, and other such effects that you typically have the answers necessary for every situation. And it's the reason why we're so confident relying on Madcap Experiment, because if you really, really want that card, you will eventually be able to get to it. Obviously, it's able to threaten an ultimate into the long game, but most of the time, things are going to be resolved before that. Like I said, that card filtering is absolutely absurd, being able to rummage every single turn. And overall, it's one of those cards that is going to constantly be on the cusp of banning, or at least be in the discussion for banning, because it is just such an auto include in a lot of these control strategies. I think run of 4 of them is absolutely perfect. A slightly larger planeswalker, it being now at 5 mana, is Ral Izzet Viceroy. This was a kind of classic blue-red control win condition, at least for a little bit in regular Modern, especially in these Kiki-Jiki combo variants, but in recent times, it's definitely fallen out of favor. That being said, given the way in which multi-modern functions as a format, I think that could come back into play. It's a very splashy card, and it similarly has the ability to loot, rummage, and just sculpt your hand in the same way that Teferi does, but it has a little bit more velocity when it comes to threatening a win condition by getting an ult there out onto the battlefield. Teferi, even though you're able to take it up every turn, it needs to get to at least 10 loyalty before you could actually do the double time lock. Moving on from there, let's get on into our spells and talk about how these work within the general time span of the deck. Early on, you're considering lightning bolting and opting your way towards that well-sculpted hand, and what you could do with this is kind of pick and choose the way that you want to move into the mid-game, be that either do you want to stick to Teferi or Ral, or do you just want to get into your bigger counter spells and just try to wear down the enemies on the board a little bit more? These are the cards that allow you to do that. The Consider is probably the best version of the card in the format right now. Unlike Storm, there's really no need to kind of conceal your overarching game plan, and putting things into the graveyard is great because you're able to use it in tandem with things like Snapcaster Mage. That being said, I think that given the density of graveyard interaction, or the ability to put cards in the graveyard that this deck has, I may be looking to add another synergistic graveyard styled card to the deck, and we'll talk about that when we get to the maybe board. Lightning Bolt, classic removal spell. Sure, maybe it's fallen out of favor just a little bit, but it's still able to answer so much in the format, and plus we're running their big brother in the Unholy Heat anyway. But yeah, Bolt is just absolutely fantastic. It allows you to ping down planeswalkers. It's a great political piece because maybe you can't do all the damage you need to with just one lightning bolt, but you can kind of work with your opponents to get down to problematic creature or other permanent. Bolt Snap Bolt is also a very solid finisher in the deck, just in case you don't draw into one of your other win conditions. Overall, it's just a very flexible spell. Running 4 of them, I think, is absolutely fine. I'm never mad to draw into it because I know it's always going to have some amount of value. Opt, like I said, works in tandem with Consider. The Scry's maybe slightly less good than Surveil, but overall, it's still worthy of being put into this deck as a 4 of. It's the premier set of cantrips that we're going to be running. I do consider Serum Visions a little bit, as we will talk about in the maybe board, but I think that operating at instant speed, especially with 2 opponents, just makes it so that you really want to run the 2 1-mana cantrips that are able to go at instant speed. Unholy Heat, kind of alluded to when I was talking about Lightning Bolt. This is a card that will allow for you to resolve a lot of these bigger, more problematic permanents and get them off the battlefield. It basically works perfectly in tandem with all of these graveyard impacting effects that we have, all of the looting and shuffling that we do, and so it's very, very good to get 4 of them so you can draw it as frequently as possible and just control those things that you aren't able to counterspell down. Speaking of counterspelling down, we move on into our counterspell package, starting with the classic Counterspell. Finally printed into the format. We're all very happy about that. And, you know, it's great. It is kind of a card that, alongside our creature package, really compels us to go for a much more blue-heavy land base. And because of that, it kind of clarifies the way that we build out the rest of our spell suite, right? Because you can see all the blue pips that come through. Yeah, it is just classic answer all, one of the most valuable things to keep in your arsenal because it is so broad and it doesn't have any other parameters besides just countering target spell. This is one of the ones that you really want to keep in hand as frequently as possible. Yeah, it is a powerhouse and all-star in the format. Archmage's Charm, similarly, another Modern Horizons introduced card that just absolutely wrecks face. Being able to play this modally allows for you to continue that pathway of hand sculpting. You're able to steal things like Ragavans with it. It is disgusting at 3 mana, and it is one of the high priority keeps from early on into the game when I'm mulliganing, just because it is just absolutely going to clean house, especially against specific types of decks. Those aggro decks that are relying upon like 1 or 2 creatures, for instance. It is just really, really good to have. Force Negation, we're running 4 of them. This is just your main way of dealing with combo decks from early on. It's a great political tool. Once again, it provides a lot of mental pressure to the board, and so a lot of people will be looking at you to use this to shut down anyone that's trying to go in with an all-in combo early on in the game, things like that. So it's always good to at least allude to having it in hand, and therefore if people know your deck list, it's always the most scary if you're running 4 of them, because that provides you the highest likelihood of actually having it in situations where it's necessary. Going on from there, we're running 4 Prismari Command. While it isn't a counterspell, it provides quite a bit of value. It's one of your main ways of interacting with enemy artifacts, so that is always a plus to have, and its modality just means that it has value even out of those narrow situations. We're running 4 of them just because we're never really mad about casting it. There's always something to hit on board with the 2 damage. It's always good to continue to loot, sculpt the hand, etc., etc. Cryptic Command, we're running 4 of these. Blast from the Past in regards to the current trajectory of regular Modern. It's much better here, just because even though it's a huge mana investment, typically you have the ability to play these splashy cards if the game goes late, and it can also just completely destroy some basic strategies. I think it is going to become even better if it is a case that Dark Depths gets unbanned, because now you're going to have a way to easily bounce a Merit Lodge, but that's something to talk about in the future. As for now, there's still plenty of things that's good to tap down or to bounce away. Drawing a card is always fun, and countering a spell is just one of the best things ever written on a Magic card. Going on from there, let's talk about the Madcap Experiment Platinum Empyrean combo a little bit more. Basically, this card prevents us from running any other artifacts because we need to consistently hit the Platinum Empyrean, but if things go right and this resolves, you're basically getting a 4 mana 8/8 that makes it so your life total can't change. Now, there are obviously a lot of other win conditions that exist in Blue Moon decks coming from the regular Modern background. Through the Breach and Kiki Jiki plus Deceiver Exarch are really the 2 styles that you see outside of the Madcap Empyrean combo, and those 2 are typically the ones that have a little bit more prominence in the base format of Modern. Madcap Experiment Platinum Empyrean is something that is a little bit more answerable in regular Modern, especially with the sideboard, because they can just blow up artifacts with a lot more freedom. But what's really nice here in Multi-Modern is by virtue of it being a non-sideboardable format, we are still at a point in time where the metagame isn't necessitating a ton of artifact hate or other things that are able to answer the Platinum Empyrean. And so therefore, in a lot of cases, what you're doing is you're jamming this turn 4, turn 5, and basically completely stonewalling out, especially aggro decks that have tried to get as many redundant copies of damage dealing effects into their deck as possible at the expense of some amount of utility. And so therefore, you just completely shut down half these decks, and the other half of the decks really just have to have an answer, and boom, your control deck. You can run your counter spells, you can knock what few remaining pieces of interaction that they have out of the way, and given the fact that it's a 100 card deck with high amounts of variance within it, it's very rare that they're going to have redundant effects able to answer Platinum Empyreans. Plus, you can always Madcap Experiment for another one. That's the scary part about it. Obviously in the future you can start raw casting Platinum Empyreans as well, and that could just be a solid way for you to get to your win condition if the game goes long. And there really isn't much that this loses to. At the point at which you're getting a Platinum Empyrean down, the hope is that the all-in combo decks that are able to win through something like Thassa's Oracle have been shut out of the game, either due to your early interaction or other players kind of focusing them down already. And so with that in mind, I think that this is actually the best win condition that Moonless Blue Moon can have in the multi-modern format. Kiki Jiki Deceiver Exarch is very, very mana hungry, and it is something that I think requires a harder lock on the board than Madcap and Platinum Empyrean does in order for it to work. And unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that there still is some amount of velocity to be had in this, and you can't counter every spell that comes out. You can't go 1-for-1 with both opponents, while in regular Modern, you're able to do that with a lot more comfort. Same thing with Through the Breach. While it is another low mana cost way to win a game, the problem is that because you're putting an Emrakul down and not actually getting the extra turn that the Aeon's Torn gives you if you cast it regularly, what happens is that you're able to typically kill or at least put one opponent really far behind, but you don't really have a way to reassemble the combo to do it again, because the Emrakul is going to be reshuffled back into your library, and instead of just having the Madcap, casting the Madcap and flipping an Empyrean from in your library every time that you resolve the experiment, you actually need to have both an Emrakul as well as a Through the Breach in your hand, and that's just a little bit more difficult to do consistently, and it's just not worth trying to go for, given the fact that you have to do it twice typically to win games. The last spell that we have are 2 Memory Deluges. This is just another way to draw cards, build a better hand. You can oftentimes access the flashback into the late game with relative ease, and also you can do stuff like cast it off of Snapcaster Mage at its regular casting cost, just in case the actual flashback is too expensive for you to handle at that point in time. Going on from there, we got 2 dress downs. I kind of want to go up to 4, but honestly, we just have so many other good effects in the deck. I'm kind of struggling to get this to a place where I'm able to run a full playset. Maybe in the future, with some more refinement, we can figure out that it's worth it to cut, say, lightning bolts for it, but I'm very happy with it at 2, especially because it can be a narrow effect in this format. All right, and continuing on, let's go through the last category of cards in the deck with our 38 lands. The 2 Academy runes looks a little bit weird, but I have several reasons why I'm running 2 of them. One, it's always nice to natural draw it. It's not a fetchable card, and you typically want to try to see at least one of them if a game is going long. So 2, I think, is the right rate at which you're able to do that, especially giving all of our sorting effects. And obviously, the only thing it can target is a Plat Empyrean, but let's put it this way. Sometimes in a game, your opponents will be able to answer 1 Plat Empyrean. Sometimes, in very rare cases, they're going to answer 2. I'm telling you, though, if you are at the point at which you're able to get a Plat Empyrean back on top of your library and either have the Madcap in hand to cheat it out, or you just are at a point where you could start raw casting it, eventually they're going to run out of answers, and Plat Empyrean effectively works as a Platinum Angel at that point. There's no real way that they can win through it, and so you can basically lock them very similar to how Bluetron Mindslaver locks with Academy runes if you play your cards correctly. Alright, going on from there, we're running 2 Castle Vantresses. This just once again acts as a sorting card. It's perfectly fine to run 2 of them by virtue of it not being legendary. Honestly, I could see going up given how blue hungry our deck is and the fact that we are really down on red pips in this current iteration of the deck. We're running 4 Fiery Islet for further draw. If there's something I would change from this deck, it would actually be the trade out of 2 Fiery Islets for 2 more Castle Vantresses. Part of the reason is that you actually can't pay 1 a life because of Platinum Empyrean, so it kind of shuts down your own lands, and at that point you just have to sacrifice it to draw cards, and that can always be awkward, especially if you want to keep a bunch of mana up as protection for the Plat Empyrean. We're running 1 Hall of Storm Giants. This is a really nice card, just another big finisher later on. It's very, very mana hungry, and so I really don't like playing a bunch of them, but it's a perfectly fine addition to the deck, and, you know, occasionally will have some contingent value as a way to push through for a victory. 7 Islands, because once again, we definitely are far more dense on our blue than we are on our red, and then 4 Mountains as the rest of our basic lands, because while it is always the case that in decks where you have a dominant color and a color that is less prevalent, you need to have a higher density of the dominant color, I do feel that there's a lot of bad moments in which you actually can't provide the secondary color, and so I like to have a slightly skewed ratio where you have more mountains than your spell suite would actually call for. Mostly because we also have a lot of generic mana costs that are perfectly cromulent to be paid by red mana as well as blue mana. To Otawaris Soaring City. This is a perfectly fine card once again. The issue that I have with it in every deck in which I run it is that it is a very expensive channel. We really don't have a whole lot that would be able to reduce its cost, and so because of that, I am down to 2 of them. I just feel that you should be able to answer most of the permanents either via counter spells or removal, so that Otawara just isn't actually what you need to do in any given situation. We're running full Scalding Tarn and 4 Misty Rainforests as our fetch land suite. 4 Spire Bluff Canal, just because having access to that early blue-red is super nice. And then 4 Steam Vents as our classic Shockland to fuel the ability to balance between red and blue mana. Alright, and so with that in mind, that's a Multi-Modern Moonless Blue Moon as it currently stands. We're running the Platinum Empyrean finishing package, and with that in mind, the way that I want to talk about this deck is less as a full-on control deck, which obviously is very powerful and has a lot of value, but I want to talk specifically about how Plat Empyrean Madcap Experiment is oriented as the finisher, and the reason why you would play this deck, say, over a blue-white or Esper control deck in this format. I think it's very good. Like I said before, it requires very specific answers from your opponents. Obviously, creature removal can occasionally knock the Platinum Empyrean off of its pedestal, but think about it. Right now, Unholy Heat is one of the most dominant removal spells in the format, and while it hits things like Primeval Titans, it cannot knock out an 8/8. And so you really need something that says, exile target creature, destroy target creature, and those effects do exist, but they don't exist at the prominence you would expect. And furthermore, because of the high variance of cards in a lot of these decks, people aren't running enough of these specific types of narrow removal so that the ability for them to have it is enough for me to be off of the Plat Empyrean plan. I'm very happy with the level of variance that it provides, and like I said, even though it's something that is occasionally hard to draw into, 4 copies feels fine just due to the fact that you have so much ability to sort in the early game. And with that in mind, you're using a lot of your pieces early to play more like a combo deck than you would expect, because you're giving up on some amount of counter spells, some amount of mid into late game interaction to try to get to the Madcap. After that point, after you have the lock, you can then work towards a much more controlling game plan. But part of the reason why I'm continually drawn to this deck is because it has that combo in it, right? And yeah, with that perspective in mind, I think this deck is very strong. I think it's healthy. I don't think it is necessarily the best control archetype. I think that Esper may still take that cake, as there are certain types of decks that you really feel you have very little control over. And meanwhile, blue-white just has far more inevitability because they're able to stabilize their planeswalkers a little bit better and get better value engines going with, say, Big Teferi rather than Teferi Master of Time. But those things can oftentimes just feel moot because you're able to play red, being able to kill things with Unholy Heat that you otherwise would have to spend a lot more mana in order to do so with things like March of Otherworldly Light or Prismatic Ending feels really good. Lightning Bolt, like I said before, can help in those frustrating situations where you have the lockdown but nobody's conceding and you need to start doing damage. And overall, I do think that this is truly the best way for an Izzet Mage to play control deck, and I really don't think that it is hurt at all by having to play against 2 other players. If anything, Blue Moon is better in this format than it currently is in regular Modern. Alright, with that in mind, getting that position in the metagame out of the way, let's talk a little bit about what this deck can do to change it in the future. First, let's go through the ban list, and then I'm going to walk through my maybe board. On the topic of the ban list, there's really not a whole lot that I think that comes off of the ban list that will go cleanly into this deck. Maybe Punishing Fire, but even that is relatively iffy. There's obviously some things that are completely Braziled that could be good. We would probably run the G-Probe. We would probably run Mental Misstep, but I really don't think those are ever going to be cards that see the light of day, so I would not really worry about it. I think far more innovation is going to come not from unbans, but rather just from people iterating and trying to adapt the deck so it suits the velocity and play style of the pod that they are in. And so with that in mind, let's go through the Moon Maybe board. You can see that I have included a lot of these more tempo-oriented cards that would most likely kind of bring this deck back over from the boundary of being a control deck back into being a mid-range deck, but I still think that they're worth talking about here. Delver of Secrets in particular is a card that you don't see having a lot of play in regular Modern. It gets removed relatively easily, but like I said, creature removal is at a premium in this format, and I think that having an early flying threat like this could actually do a whole lot to put pressure on the board during times in which control decks oftentimes struggle. The value of the Delver, I think, is furthermore benefited by your ability to control what's on top of your deck with scries and whatnot a lot more frequently. It would be an argument for running the Delver in combination with Serum Visions, just because it allows for very early game flipped Delver setups. And also, this, because it is such a low threat card early on, at least in the grand scheme of what many much faster decks are doing in multi-modern, it allows for you to just kind of sit there with it as a 1/1 until you're able to flip it, and because of our spell density, it's going to happen eventually. Darcy is a card that is probably the most heavily considered of the one drops. I feel like Ragavan has some amount of value, but honestly, I just hate this freaking card and really don't want to include it. Darcy, on the other hand, once again, feeds back into our overarching game plan of just hand sculpting as our main means of interacting and overcoming the fact that you have to answer two people at once. I think that it just does a whole lot to build up your threat base early on as well, because it is another hard to interact with flyer. Already talked about how much I hate Ragavan. It's good. There's really not much else to say. It's not aligned super well with the overarching game plan of Blue Moon by means of, being a card that has good late game inevitability. It's just so good that any deck running red thinks about running it. So I'm going to put it in here so that people don't, attack me in the comments for it. Deeper on in, we have Deceiver Exarch. This is part of the Kiki combo package. This is the second level of combo that I would be comfortable running in the Blue Moon deck. You could conceivably resolve a Kiki or Deceiver Exarch on one turn and then go off with the rest of the combo later on. It is possible that the amount of counterspell and the amount of interaction that our deck has makes it so that you're going to be able to consistently protect the Kiki, but I personally think that the Plat Empyrean is just so much cleaner currently. In the future, though, if Artifact Hate or specific types of hate that target the Plat Empyrean become a bit more valuable, maybe I'll consider this combo, but for the time being, it's going to stay relegated to the maybe board. V-Click is a card that's pretty interesting. I like its effect, but given the fact that you are going up against two opponents, hand disruption of the sort that Vendilion Click brings to the table, especially at 3 mana, I just feel is a little bit underpowered. You could obviously V-click yourself for further hand sculpting, but that always feels relatively suboptimal, at least in my opinion. So it's another maybe board inclusion. I kind of wish I had a better stat line for 3 mana, just given the fact that at that point you should hopefully be ramping up your control and your win con aspects of the deck. Going on from there, we have Niv Mizzet Perun. This is the win condition I have currently in blue-red midrange, and I actually really love it there. It is a card that's able to get in under other control decks in the format, and so if you find yourself in that kind of mirror match, this is a fantastic mirror breaker. When it comes out, you just provide such a solid clock for yourself. It's very hard to interact with. It could get unholy heated, but otherwise it's very, very difficult to remove. You cannot prismatic ending it, for instance. And so because of that, I think that it really has a home as a consideration for maybe not as solid of a win con as Plat Empyrean, but something that provides great inevitability for your deck. Murktide Regent, once again, this is a card that is included in the blue-red mid-range list that I run, but I think that it isn't really what Control is aiming to do at the mana cost that you're typically playing it at. Obviously, with your hand sculpting, it's obviously great to just exile a bunch of things and get a very cheap Murktide onto the battlefield, but given the fact that when you have already sorted your hand to the extent to which you're able to by getting down Rowler to Fairy, the hope is that you need something better than a Murktide to close out the game, or you're looking for other ways to win outside of just basic creature combat. And so while I do like the card, I find it less necessary than one would immediately think, even though we're filling up our graveyard so heavily. Emrakul is part of the Through the Breach line. I already talked a little bit about why I think Emrakul is the suboptimal game plan for this deck. Through the Breaching it is very powerful, and you can get one person out of the game, but it becomes a messy situation once you have to now kill the other person at the table. Maybe it's the case that our overarching inevitability in being a control deck means that if you're able to kill one person, the other person will follow shortly after, even without Emrakul. But at 5 mana, I'd much rather just cast Madcap Experiment and then opt or something, or hold up a Lightning Bolt. I just think that it's better. And maybe I'll be proven wrong on that, but for the time being, I think it's definitely the 3rd level or even 4th level win con behind Niv Mizzet. For our Planeswalkers, we have a few really interesting ones. Narset Parta Veils is just very nice. It's a good stacks piece to shut down the ability for the other people at the table to accrue a ton of value. The fact that you have so much card draw means that it creates great asymmetries across the board, but it gets lightning rodded down quite a bit by virtue of it hurting 2 players and not really providing a win condition unto itself. And so at 3 mana, I typically find myself much more happier with something like an Archmage's Charm on the table. Obviously, there is a possibility that it is worth it, and I think that in some pods, especially pods with combo decks, this can be a huge boon. But for right now, I think that is much more of a tech card than something I would put into a generic version of Moonless Blue Moon. The Royal Scions is interesting. The Royal Scions goes super well with a more creature-oriented game plan. So let's just say we choose to put in Murktide Regent or Niv Mizzet. And what this allows you to do is just kind of beat down face a little bit more efficiently. I even consider it in the base Moonless Blue Moon list that I have here, because it can basically lead to your Platinum Empyrean just straight up winning the game through combat. And also, at 3 mana, it's a very efficient effect, given that it still has that rummage / looting effect as their other +1 ability. It's very much on the cusp of playability, and I would consider cutting Ral for it. If Teferi Experience is banned, it's one of the first things I think that I'm going to put on the list. JTMS, obviously a good, almost a legendary Magic card. I don't think that it's super well positioned in a multiplayer format by virtue of it being so reliant on targeting down one person, but maybe it is the case that in the 1v1 it just acts as the perfect mirror breaker for late game shenanigans. I think that it's probably suboptimal, especially as long as TMOT continues to exist in the multi-modern format though. For our spells, we got some interesting choices here. Serum Visions, like I said, combos very nicely with Delver of Secrets as a way to just rearrange the top of your library. It would allow for pretty frequent flips, and it's always on the cusp of playability. I just currently really heavily value the ability to loot or otherwise cantrip at instant speed in the current cantrip package and draw package that we have in the base deck. Spell Snare, very narrow but incredibly powerful, can create huge blowouts, but I think that it's just kind of a card that sits right at the very edge. I'd rather have something a little bit more generic, given how broad open the format is for multi-modern. And so with that in mind, I'm keeping it maybe boarded. Thought Scour is another kind of cantrip effect. The milling can provide some amount of power. I think that if I were running Murktide, I would consider playing Thought Scour over Opt, but I think the scrying is really, really nice, and it just helps sort through your deck a little bit more. Meanwhile, the Thought Scour effect itself can sometimes hurt you if you wanted to draw something, and it's always feels bad if that's the case. I like Remand a lot. Remand is something that you see a lot more frequently in regular Modern than you do in multi-Modern outside of things like Storm, but given the fact that this is a format where you have multiple players all who are trying to enact relatively powerful game plans, I think that delaying for a turn is typically not as valuable as it is in a 1v1 scenario, because sure, you're able to answer, you're able to draw a card, but now the hope is that you have to draw into something that's able to fully answer them next turn, when instead you could just be playing extra counter spells in this deck. that fully answer a problem as they occur. So with that in mind, I like Remand, but it's not good enough, I think, in Moonless Blue Moon. Anger of the Gods. This is one of the few board wipes that you can run in blue-red. What I really like about it is that while it does wipe a lot of things that you are bringing to the battlefield, you typically have such a small board presence anyway, and as long as Platinum Empyrean lives, you're in really good shape. I guess the question is, if you're running Platinum Empyrean, why do you care at all about creature presence on the battlefield? If we went to a different win condition like Kiki-Jiki, where you aren't putting anything down until you're straight up winning the game that turn, maybe it'll be a little bit better, but for right now, I'm keeping it out of the deck. Through the Breach, we already talked about as part of the Emrakul combo. Going down, we could theoretically, go to a moon strategy. We have Blood Moon, not Blood Moon, excuse me. We have Blood Moon, we have Magus of the Moon as two potential cards. Given the fact that we are two colors, this is not super harmful to us. Obviously, because we're very blue heavy, I think that running Blue Moon would require us to run a few more basics and have less of these dual lands like the Steam Vents, like the Spire Bluff Canals. But it's totally runnable, and I think something that you can really easily include into an iteration of this deck. I just feel that given how heavily varied the format is, I don't really want to push people back towards only red mana, especially because there's several very prominent aggro strategies that are completely mono red, and those are the decks that we do not want to help out at all, right? And so maybe if the format slows down further and people go more and more towards, say, money pile decks, this will be better. But for right now, I think that staying moonless is the correct way forward for Blue Moon. Shark Typhoon is the last card I want to talk about. This was originally in my list, but I realized that it's actually too slow. I understand why people like it, but every single time that I goldfished with it, I'm not really creating a dominant board state until, turns 9 or 10, even later than that. And at that point, there's just so many other threats in this format, even in control mirror matches, that I don't think that it's efficient to run. I think that I'd much rather just try to defend the Platinum Empyrean combo or try to ult a Ral rather than going for the creature combat game plan by just getting a bunch of sharks down onto the battlefield. And that is all of Moonless Blue Moon kind of laid out for you guys. Obviously, this is a deck with huge amounts of fluidity in how it's played, how it's built, and I hope that this video can act as a solid springboard for people to begin to iterate in their own way upon how it's constructed, because it's not my kind of deck. I do love blue-red, obviously, but I'm much more on line with these combo-oriented decks, and there's just so much work to be doing on the front of Oops All Spells, Amulet Titan, Storm, etc. But yeah, if someone wants to adopt this, make their own version of it, please refer to my lists. They're all posted up in the Discord. And if you ever want to talk about Moonless Blue Moon, I am down. It is something that I would love to see grow and become a more staple part of the format. And with all that in mind, I'm going to be heading out for the day. You all have a wonderful time. I will see you around with another deck very soon.